If there was any conspiracy, it was the conspiracy to save money by Port Authority of New York and New Jersey and the designers who cooperated to make the cost of this building down.
So one of the towers, nobody was able to escape above the impact point because all of the staircases were severed. And in the other one, 2 out of 3 were severed. The other one was partially severed, and only a few people were able to escape. So, because of this stairwell issue alone, I mean, people had time to evacuate. They just didn't have an avenue in which to do so. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a very special 9/11 edition of the Stream of Consciousness. I'm your host, Cyrus, and with us is friend of the show, Professor Astaneh, who was a professor of structural engineering at UC Berkeley for 32 years. He was on the ground at Ground Zero on September 18th to do work for the National Science Foundation under a grant. That research ultimately led to testimony in front of the Congress in the Committee on Science. So Professor Astaneh, we're really looking forward to your stories, to some myth busting, to some education. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cyrus, for the opportunity. I want to really express my condolences to the families of victims and also honor the first responders, police, other forces and people who helped to save the others on that tragic day.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you mentioning that. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary here in a week, and it's very important to keep all those people in mind. Today, we are going to be honoring them by spreading the message of as much truth as we can about, frankly, the unbelievably bad or unusual design of this building, how it was unique in many, many different ways that ultimately led to its failure. And we're also going to be talking about your experiences too. So I think the storytelling part of it's going to be kind of interesting for folks. Can you just start on that unfortunate day, 9/11, and walk us through that next week where you found yourself in New York? What was the sequence of events there?
I sat there and watched it, and I realized there is something absolutely different. My expertise and area of interest is in steel structures, protection of steel structures against terrorist attacks. Especially, I was very familiar with World Trade Center, but I was not familiar with the structural system used here. It's absolutely totally different than a typical high-rise building. It was very, very strange system they used. My opinion is to save money. There were so many irregularities that they violated, did not follow the known practice of structural engineering. That particular day, I got maybe, I count like for 50, 60 calls from all over the world interviewing me about this because I was listed at UC Berkeley site as the faculty who studies protection of buildings and bridges against terrorist attack. We had a interview, 15 minutes there. That was the first time actually imagine, like 8 hours after the collapse, that I ended up having the opportunity to explain to public what might have happened, which I summarized as the fire that caused by jets getting into the building and starting the fire caused the building, those floors that were on the fire, to basically get weak. Fire makes the steel weak. Steel cannot resist the force if it gets warmer and warmer.
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt, Professor Astaneh. That's an important point that I want to address just because it's very common with the conspiracy people. They'll say that jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams. In fact, you heard the director Spike Lee bring it up recently he had an 8-hour thing on HBO and he gave 30 minutes of it to these conspiracy theory guys, the 9/11 architects and engineers for truth, just a bunch of clowns really. And anyway, he came out saying the same thing: jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams. So can you I know Spike Lee has engineering skills just as same as yours. I'm just kidding.
Let me state that absolutely this whole conspiracy theory is absolutely false. There's a famous picture they used to use a lot, that shows me looking at a steel that is basically melted and part of the steel is gone. But that steel actually is melted and gone when it was after collapse, under a car, it's very clear this is steel, was under a car, and that there were many cars for a couple of weeks that I was there on fire. The ground zero was creating smoke and fire for weeks. So that was the steel piece that had nothing to do with the fire in the 76th floor or 84th floor. It was on the ground and was under a car that was burning and that it still melted. Used it and used my name saying that, you know, Astaneh had this thing there right after collapse and he shows melting. I had to write an email to these people, these conspiracy theorists, architects and engineers, and in a way, not threatening, but warning them that I'm going to really sue them because they are misrepresenting me, using my research, which I'm clearly saying this is not melting of steel when it was at the, you know, standing up and carrying load. This was the debris down in the ground zero weeks after collapse that it was ended up melting a little piece. And actually, that steel is not from towers. That is from WT7. I have a word for Mr. Lee, Spike Lee, and people like him. You know, I have a lot of respect for his artistic works. I've seen his
Do the Right Thing was awesome.
But let me tell you, Mr. Lee, and anyone like him, you need to talk to victims' families, and I've worked with them, especially with Sally Regenhardt. If you haven't heard her name, go and search for that. Her son was very high IQ, starting firefighter. He went into Christian Regenhardt. He went into the World Trade Center to save others, and he never, even a DNA was found. And Sally Regenhardt formed a group with other victims' families, which is called Skyscraper Safety Campaign. Mr. Lee, please go and look at that site before you produce these very, very hurting and tragic movies and broadcast it. Don't follow these architects and structural engineers. They are making money out of that site. They have made millions out of that site. If there was any conspiracy, it was the conspiracy to save money by Port Authority of New York and New Jersey and the designers who cooperated to make the cost of this building down. So they used a system that really was not used for any high-rise since then, even before that. And that system was so vulnerable that it had no choice. It had to collapse. Even if the fire was started accidentally, if it wasn't even started by these murderers and terrorists who came and did this to our loved ones, those buildings will fail the same way.
So let's talk about that. That was a lot of interesting things right there. Number one, the concept that they were trying to save money. It's been pretty well documented that they originally were looking at an 80-something story building, but they got built to 110. Can you tell us about that, the reasoning behind it?
Yes, initially they had the money. If I remember it right, it might have been like 240 million, but that needs to be checked. They basically could build 88-story with that money. But they wanted to build taller than Empire State Building because Empire State Building at the time was making a lot of money by antennas, which initially, you know, they were radio antennas on Empire State Building, later
television, I'm sure,
television and so forth. So and microwave and all kinds of telecommunication antennas, millions of dollars. So they wanted to make sure this is taller than that, and that was 110 stories. So
then they could get those contracts, is what you're saying. So they could get the radio antenna money.
Yes, absolutely. Money. But the name that was important was Skilling. Skilling was a structural engineer who actually came up with this very strange, very vulnerable structural system for the World Trade Center that I will explain. No one has used this system before or after for anything important. The seed of this tragedy that was planted that day by Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, giving the grant to this group of Skilling, and Yamasaki was the architect, to go ahead And you are the one designed this 110 story with the money that was for 88 story.
All right, so Professor Astaneh, we're going to talk about some of the unusual aspects of this building. The first one's not so much structural, but it was absolutely critical, and that is that the staircases were very few in number and very narrow. For a building of this size, can you talk about the unusual staircases?
Yeah, first of all, staircases are codified. There has to be sufficient number of staircases, but more importantly, staircases should be away from the center. There should be kind of like at the corners and away on both sides. So if there is fire on one side of the building or center of the building, people can escape in the opposite direction. In this case, in my opinion, in order to have a lot of view offices around the building, you can see it's like a donut shape on this plan here on the left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They put elevators, all staircases at the center, right? And the toilets and everything. So they can sell or rent the whole outside area. But that is not good. Code does not allow that. You have to let people escape in opposite of fire. If fire is on the right side, they go to the left side and go escape route.
And yes, this was not, to jump in again, this is not some theoretical point. One of the towers, nobody was able to escape above the impact point because all of the staircases were severed. And in the other one, 2 out of 3 were severed. The other one was partially severed, and only a few people were able to escape. So, because of this stairwell issue alone, I mean, people had time to evacuate. They just didn't have an avenue in which to do so. And by putting the stairwells in this central core like this, where 3 got destroyed on one and 2.5, or all, pretty much all 3 on the other one, that's where the victims came from. They would have otherwise had an opportunity to escape. Is that not true?
Absolutely. See, so about 1,500 people were trapped above these staircases because North Tower, the plane came exactly at the center of the building and cut all 3 staircases. Now, these 3 staircases cut, 1,500 people were trapped at the top. Then there was a roof, of course, staircase going roof. They could probably escape to the roof, and maybe helicopters could save them, or at least get to the roof and then get fresh air or whatever. But they had welded apparently locked or something like that no one could get to the roof. Why? Because years ago that French, guy who goes through throw a rope between 2 towers and walk.
The rope walker, the high wire walker. Yeah.
Oh yes.
Did a movie about him.
So 1,500 people were trapped in the North Tower. Now, why the 3 staircases were kind of like completely cut out so no one can pass through them? The staircases in tall buildings should have masonry walls, either concrete or concrete masonry, solid masonry walls. You cannot have gypsum boards for staircases. And also staircases should be pressurized. So when the fire, for example, and smoke is in a floor, people run to staircases, then the smoke cannot get into staircases because staircases have high pressure and the air is coming from staircase to the floor. So this issue of pressurized staircase is very important. And the issue of walls of staircases should be concrete or masonry is very important. In this case, again, in my view, to save money, of course, they use gypsum board. Can you imagine if you
Guys, this is what you have, guys. This is basically what you have in your house, right? If you're not familiar with what a gypsum board is, like it's just just a regular old house. You're like the drywall.
Yeah, drywall. Yeah, if you put a nail on drywall. It's very interesting, Cyrus. In 1993, there was another attack on the World Trade Center, right? They put the same group, terrorists, put a van at the basement of North Tower, trying to explode it and collapse the North Tower and South Tower and so forth. It didn't collapse, but when the explosion happened, there was a lot of fire and smoke. And this smoke got into the staircases and elevator shafts. And you know what happened? 1,000 people got smoke injuries because what happened was there was no pressurized staircase and the smoke the staircases acted like a smokestack.
Yeah, it's like a big chimney.
This is very interesting, Cyrus. This is not very much publicized. There were three people, according to the New York Times story, at that time. There were three people who were trapped in the elevator, and they were kind of like in the middle of the story. The elevators were cut out, and they kind of like they had their car switched. The way I read, they kind of like look at the wall of the elevator, and one of them kicks it and says, "Oh my God, this is breaking!" So they break the wall of elevator using the car switches and their hand and
shoes or something, just whatever you got on them, your keys, you're just digging in it with your key.
Yeah, and then they got out of it.
Oh
now, no one at the time, really, any engineers said that, my God, if you can break the wall of elevator shaft with your hand, so this is the story of staircases.
They were actually not to interrupt you, Professor Astaneh, but actually I think we're only halfway through the story of the staircases because we haven't talked about the width or the fact that they didn't go straight down to the bottom.
Oh yeah.
So let's start first with the width of the staircases. Talk about that.
Yeah, why don't you go back to...
Here we go, right here. Look at this.
This picture is actually from World Trade Center Tower 1, the North Tower. So when it was hit, of course, people started going down. No one thought that it's going to collapse. So you can see that people are evacuating.
Some people actually got talked into going back into their offices, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, that is the World Trade Center 2. Actually, that's a good point you brought up. Let me tell you that one. First of all, let me finish this. You can see this. Right? Look at the firefighter, this young hero going up, but with the load, with all the equipment, there is no room even, for people to go down. Or these were just very much, 4 foot and all the same for 110 floors. Imagine, when you have this many people coming down, as they come down, you have to widen the staircases because they're adding up, right?
But weren't they also unusually wide? They're unusually thin. They're like 48 inches or 54 inches. That's like really narrow.
You're very narrow. If they had gone to city and said that we have like only 3 staircases, they're all at the center at one point, which really means nothing. It's like having 1 staircase because you cannot escape in any other direction. If the fire is at the center, which is the place usually fire is, there are all kind of pipes, all kind of electricity wires going up and down. That is the place where you get fire. You have no choice. It's a death trap. It was a death trap from beginning, even for natural fire, yet alone this kind of fire that was very intense. So that was it. But you mentioned that public service that they was talking to occupants. In fact, when the first tower was hit, the people started evacuating, of course, the North Tower, people who were below the stairs. Unfortunately, people above the stairs, 1,500 people trapped, and they completely perished. But people below the impact floor started evacuating the North Tower. Well, of course, the people in South Tower saw that, but this was between the hit. In other words, that 15 minutes between the North Tower was hit, but the South Tower was not hit. That 15 minutes or so difference. During that period, can you imagine the responsible people who were broadcasting the messages to occupants? They were saying that, don't go out, that's the North Tower only, go back to work. Can you imagine? They were telling occupants, go back to work. If I remember, a couple of hundred people actually were there, still up there about the impact for the South Tower when the next plane hit. But the next plane hit from the corner, it wasn't right at the center. So that destroyed 2 staircases. And as you mentioned correctly, the other staircase was damaged, but I think 3 or 4 people escaped. Actually,
they basically had to like jump down a floor, a bit more or less.
Yeah, I met one of them in LA when I presented my findings to City of Los Angeles, kind of like a couple of months after, and he was there, and I talked to him, and he said that right after that I retired, and he doesn't work. The trauma is such that at that time he told me that he's not going to work. He's just cannot work. And in this case, what went wrong was, in my opinion, Port Authority of New York and New Jersey decided to save money and build a structure with less money than it was necessary.
On the stairwells, one more point to make, they didn't go straight down. So here's a diagram of what the stairwells looked like. So people would have to go down for a while, exit into an unfamiliar office, like re-enter, come back. I mean, what was going on with these things, Professor Astaneh?
Absolutely illegal in my view. And you are panicked, you are trying to escape from this, and probably there's a smoke in all floors because the staircases are acting like chimney. So you imagine yourself coming from that from the top green staircase, that pipe. Those are
right here, up here.
You're coming down. You get into that, I think it's like the 70th floor.
Yeah, 80th.
You come out.
Yeah.
Have you been into these open offices with all these cubicles and others in any design office? They're all kind of copiers, water coolers. Can you find your way to the door that goes to the staircase? And if you find it, again, you're going to go to these narrow staircases down inside the smoke and come out again. Look at the other one.
Yeah, you got to come out. You're coming out once. You're coming out again. You're going all over the place. You're traveling all over the place.
Why did they do it? Because those places that they come out, those are big amphitheaters or big conference halls, and those are very, very good for rental. So they don't care that if these staircases going down cannot go down straight. I haven't seen anything like this. I'm not expert in a staircase and exits. That's the architects and people who are experts in that. I've never seen any staircase that you have to come out. As you said, I'm just using my common sense. You don't need to be engineer or anything. Just a common sense. Why? Because they wanted to have more rental, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a real point that people need to understand is that the square footage on these buildings, I mean, they rent it out by like fractions of a square foot, don't they? I mean, they get down pretty specific.
Yeah, it's called footprint. Yeah, of course. That's why actually they came up with this whole structural system that I'll talk about.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. So that's the problem with the stairwells. Numerous. We covered all those. We're going to move on now to the structural system here. Basically, the building was built like no other building that I'm aware of. Very few other buildings. It's a completely new structural system here. And the system was such that it was framed out like a normal building at the bottom, but the top was basically just like a tin can. The weight was essentially being supported by the walls of the building, and a little bit by the core, but not necessarily built out, framed, and structured with all the columns and beams that you'd expect to see in a Sears tower. Completely unlike anything else. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, yes. The bottom, as you mentioned, you see those 3 floors at the bottom. You see those vertical columns and horizontal beams. Those, as you exactly mentioned, those are typical framing system we call columns vertical, beams horizontal. And there are 7 floors like at the bottom as basement, underneath parking. So this 3 that you see there at the bottom, plus 7 underneath, make 10 stories that were very good, designed according to the standards and code. That is why actually when they did the 1993 van explosion, that was at the basement. And then the structure, which was designed properly, these 10 stories, the column did not collapse and the building did not collapse.
It was close though. It was pretty close, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You could not believe it. These columns are very big. They're like 4 feet by 5 feet. Can you imagine? Like 10-inch thick plate. Imagine a box of steel with 10-inch thickness of plate and like 4 feet by 5 foot, 4 foot. So those are huge. Of course, they are holding 110 floors. And what happened was this box with 4 sides, right? There are 4 plates. This is the box, and 3 sides. You cannot believe it, Cyrus. The 3 sides plates fractured because of the impact of explosion. The 4th side did not.
Wow.
And what happened was then, of course, columns stood there, and then, of course, the gravity pushed it down, and everything was fine. They repaired it. But imagine if it was a little bigger explosion, like 7,000 pounds of TNT equivalent rather than 5,000. The fourth side also would fracture, and the column would move. But after explosion, the gravity will push it down, and it will come down, not on the broken column, but next to it, and the whole building could have collapsed.
With no time to evacuate, no less.
So much luck, luck that it stood. But it shows that at least the traditional systems we use with columns and beams in almost every building other than these, and maybe two, three more shorter, that they use the system also.
Yeah. So let's look at these shear walls, right? I mean these I don't know what to call them actually. Bearing walls. These big bearing walls here. So in the collapse, you can actually see them here at the top. They're just like big piles of them laying around. Like you're never going to see this in any other type of building collapse where there's just like 10 stories of the front face of the building, 5 stories of the front face of the building just laying on the ground. What the hell is going on here?
Absolutely, Cyrus, it's amazing. When I was watching it on the day of collapse, and I saw these pictures at first, of course, I hadn't studied anything yet. I realized that this is absolutely strange. There is nothing like this that I've ever seen. Look at the building behind it. You see the standing building behind it? Yeah, that is typical building. You see the vertical members, you see horizontal members. We call it frame. This is not frame. As you said, this is bearing wall. These are just pieces of bearing wall that they brought in like Lego, they put on top of each other. And when it collapsed, you can see these are like, pieces of Lego.
Let's picture. There's a great picture of the World Trade Center in the sun. Let's take a look at that real quick.
Yes.
I think people can really see what the building. Look at this. So in this picture, you can see the core of the building here. Here's where the elevator shafts were that we were discussing.
Oh, yeah, staircases. Yeah.
And then you can see that there's essentially almost no internal structure except for that, right? No columns, no beams. The weight of the building is being held up essentially by the walls that are attached to this core by a series of thin metal trusses. Truss is just like a horizontal member. That's your floor, right? So when the fire comes, it's going to heat those trusses up, and they're going to start to warp. They're going to start to lose their connections with the wall, with the bearing wall. And pretty soon, the top part of the building is just going to fall on the bottom part, and that's what we all saw. The hammering effect, the sledgehammer effect, all the way into the ground. People are saying, oh, I can't believe the buildings came straight down. From a physics perspective, they had very little alternative option because they don't have enough strength. Like, you think this thing has the external strength to even tip and bend? It'll just start breaking and fall straight down. The material strength, I mean, the amount of weight versus the strength of this wall it makes no sense. It can't tilt. If it tried to, it would just break and fall straight down. And am I right about that from a physics perspective?
Absolutely. In fact, if there was anything other than that, we should have figured out if Einstein's theory and all the gravity and Newton were wrong, because gravity pulls exactly vertical, unless there is resistance to that. In this case, because the whole 4 sides, the 4 walls, as you said correctly, the whole 4 walls were hot, reached 1,000 degrees and lost their strength. Now you have this whole box of 24 stories, like for North Tower, about the fire area. This whole weight of this box is sitting on nothing, and the gravity pulls it down. Completely
and it gets worse.
Vertical.
And it actually becomes a sort of a snowball effect because every floor it hits, it adds more weight to the mass. The hammer gets heavier. So I think they did they did some analysis, and they found that you don't have to drop the top half of the building on the bottom half very far before you start to get this effect. I want to say it was like 6 inches or maybe a foot even before it has enough momentum and inertia to just completely pulverize everything in its way.
Yes. I did also that study, and it's definitely 1 floor was enough. In other words, even if 1 floor, although 3 floors were under fire, even if 1 floor, the walls these steel walls got hot and couldn't take the load, collapse, that was enough. Then after that, as you said, as it goes down, the inertia and the acceleration causes the velocity to be more and the momentum to be more.
And the tilting aspect, sorry to interrupt you, but the tilting aspect, the reason that's impossible is because there's just no enough material strength to stop that force and redirect it away from where gravity is trying to pull it. So this idea that the building can like tip sideways, it's the walls aren't strong enough. They can handle loads in the vertical, but once those start to become dynamic, horizontal, so that wall is just going to break. It doesn't have the ability to bend, does it? Like that.
Exactly. What happened actually is interesting because the North Tower was hit at the center, and the whole all four walls on the side, those steel walls, were almost the same and getting hot at the same time. So when it collapsed, all four walls collapsed, and as we talked about it, the whole top part went down vertical. But the South Tower was interesting because the South Tower, the plane hit from kind of like a corner. It wasn't right exactly at the center, symmetric. So part of the walls ended up having less heat than the others. So when the collapse started, the South Tower tilts a little bit because that corner,
holding it just a little bit.
But as soon as that corner starts going, it becomes safe because the other parts also are just at the verge of collapse, and the whole thing goes down vertical again. The only framing system was at the bottom 10 stories and the core, the staircases. But that wasn't the issue. In fact, it's interesting. Let me tell you one thing, Cyrus. Imagine the outside was this very thin, relatively thin steel plate. Of course, you put what we call stiffeners so they don't buckle. But the main load carrying system was this steel plate, a quarter of an inch at that point of impact. So what happened was inside the core, the staircases, elevator shafts, you can't put elevator shaft on steel plate. You have to have columns and beams, that these elevators move on it. So they have these big columns actually at the center, as this picture shows. You can see the staircase.
Yeah, see them right here.
So what happened is this actually. It was just amazingly coincidental that this happened like this. But when the plane came in and hit, let's say, from the left of this picture and cut through that tiny wall, came in, because the interior columns were very heavy, it hit the columns and exploded inside because of impact, okay? Not because of explosion. So spread the jet fuel on the floor. Floors didn't have any walls. It was just open 1 acre floor. So the fire started everywhere with paper and equipment, desks, and whatever. They didn't check that.
But another tragic part of it. So one other subject we'd really like to cover is the fireproofing. We mentioned that the walls were made of gypsum, but there was also what did they use, spray-on fireproofing and only a little bit of it? I can't remember. Can you tell me more about fireproofing?
What happened was that when World Trade Center was being constructed, fireproofing was asbestos-based. If your audience don't know, usually we spray this material is on a steel to prevent heat from getting to steel fast. And you put enough material to delay the fire heat getting to steel for either 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, depending on what the code says. For most buildings, steel columns and steel floor beams are fireproof for 2 hours of standing against the fire. The hope is that in 2 hours, either the content, papers, furniture, whatever is burning, it will burn out. There is no fire anymore. Or the firefighters, the ladders will reach and the water will extinguish the fire, right?
Plus, you have time to evacuate. It gives you 2 hours to evacuate.
Yeah, of course. Evacuation is the first thing, but as far as
saving
safety,
the structure, you're saying,
and it has happened. I mean, we had fires in tall buildings in Los Angeles. There was a major tall building. It had fire, 2 floors were burning for almost 10, 12 hours. But after it was extinguished, you couldn't reach it. It was higher up, like this one. But after it was finished, the content was finished, the columns actually were tested. Nothing has happened to them. They repaired it, they painted it, and the building is still in LA and is used. They even didn't change anything. The structure survived the fire. And that's what happens. Steel is vulnerable to fire, but the codes that we have predict that. We design systems, we design fireproofing for these systems, we tested them, everything works. But these guys came up with a system that no one knows how it performs, very tiny steel structure. Actually, you mentioned it, Cyrus, that they used high strength steel. That's a very important point, because what happened was this. We usually use medium strength steel in structures, because high strength steel is very brittle and buckles very fast and fractures very fast. So it's not resilient material. We don't want structures be vulnerable.
Despite the name, it's not like it's higher strength in the sense that it can handle more load per volume, but it's at the same time it's brittle. It's very brittle.
Oh, right? Absolutely. You make my life easier, because it's high strength, and because it's high strength, engineers try to use it because then you use less of it. Right. What does that mean? If you use less steel, you pay less.
Save that money.
This is exactly in line with what the clients usually want, save us money. But the codes would not allow you. If this building would have gone to permit to city, first of all, the system will be rejected from beginning. Get out of here. We can't have 100 stories like this. We don't know what this is. But they would not let this high strength steel be used, and they used high strength steel and saved like 30% in the weight of the steel that they had to buy. And the steel is sold by weight, but high strength steel is like 10% more cost to pay to buy. But if you save like 40%, already you have 30% saving by using high strength.
But you have a more brittle material. And I'll mention for our viewers out there, Professor Astaneh will be joining us in the future for an episode on another disaster of high strength steel, the east span replacement of the Bay Bridge. This was a project that was like ridiculously over budget, multi-billions, and they ended up building a structure that has both cancer of steel and cancer of concrete, two fatal conditions that can't be cured. This thing's not even 10 years old, and it's got two types of cancer already. So that's not good news. Professor Astaneh, really looking forward to that episode.
To add to those things, in fact, before this bridge even opened, 32 4-inch diameter, 3-inch diameter rods fractured. Can you imagine in the world?
Yeah, I mean, we can and will do an entire episode about how that is. They ended up building one of basically a monument to engineering stupidity, as T.Y. Lin himself referred to it. But see, guys, T.Y. Lin is the engineering firm that built this thing, and the guy it's named after, he's no longer affiliated with them. He's just big time famous engineer. He called this bridge a monument to engineering stupidity, which is kind of funny. That his namesake firm is the one that designed it. But anyway, let's get back to the World Trade Center. Professor Astaneh, you got the floor.
Well, as far as, let me add something more about fireproofing. The wall, as I mentioned, the exterior walls were steel plates, stiffened to make sure they don't buckle, but they were steel plates. Can you imagine that those steel plates did not have fireproofing inside the building? They had only fireproofing in some places outside. I'm repeating it. Fireproofing was not applied inside the place where the fire might happen, right? Fire is not going to happen in the air.
Right, 80 stories up in the air. Why would you even have it?
Right, unless there is a helicopter standing next to your building and trying to create fire next to your building.
Like a big blowtorch at the side of a helicopter.
Yeah, ridiculous. Why they did that? Because if you add fireproofing, let's say 1-inch fireproofing to protect the steel plate. First of all, we don't know how much fireproofing you should put for a steel plate. It might have been like 3-4 inches, because a steel plate is very thin.
Yeah.
Especially you used high strength, you made it thin. That's why it was like 1/4 inch. So we don't know how much fireproofing you can put a 1/4 inch plate to make sure it doesn't get hot. It has to be very thick. But they even considered that we can't put this thick fireproofing inside because that will take away from the rentable space. See, when you are renting a space in high rises, especially in downtown, like places like Manhattan, it's a square inch, even square foot. So if you put all this fireproofing, even if it's 1 inch thick, you take it like, the perimeter of building, which is like 800 foot long and 110 stories, you're talking about big square foot loss. So what they did was they just had the steel plate, and in front of it put these gypsum boards and basically as a fireproofing. But no one knows if you can fireproof steel plates for serious fire by putting these gypsum. There is no evidence, no precedent, no test, no understand. Completely, you do it in your own, shop. You design it, you build it, you approve it, you inspect it. It's just goes on with the closed thing that they did. So I think the tragic thing was just the whole system failures that the Port Authority created this system. I'm not talking about structural system. They didn't create any good structural system. They created this operational system to build these structures in a way that they could decide everything outside the book. They throw the book out. They didn't care about what the 200, 300 years of experience with building, especially the last, 200 years of tall building, especially in U.S. This is the place where tall buildings were invented in a way. We invented the tall buildings. Empire State Building is the jewel of world tall building, now 80 years old. So they throw everything out, forget about structural framing, forget about fireproofing, forget about, as long as you build it, it can stand the gravity. That's what they did. It stood gravity. And as long as it stands the wind, then we are fine. Wind that New York will see. But beyond that, what happens if there is serious fire at the center? Can people exit? Can people escape? Can the structure stand that fire? No, that wasn't a consideration. And engineers, unfortunately, helped Port Authority to achieve it. As I said, I'm not blaming Port Authority for engineering aspects. I'm just blaming them not going to city to have this checked by the city. That they should have done. But as far as engineers should have taken safety first. They did it.
And this was the outcome. Professor Astaneh, we really do appreciate you being with us here today. This has been some incredible information for the fans of the stream out there. We are going to have a future episode with Professor Astaneh, as I mentioned, on the east span replacement of the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. And we have an existing episode on the sudden tilting of the Millennium Tower. If you want more content with Professor Astaneh, you can go back and watch that. We talk about the sudden tilting. There's definitely going to be a follow-up with that because they still have no idea what the hell is going on. So friend of the show, Professor Astaneh, will be back again, I'm sure, when we get more information here over the next couple of weeks about what's going on with that disaster. So once again, thank you so much, Professor Astaneh. This was really much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Cyrus. You are doing a great job to bring facts to people. I certainly watched your other shows, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much. You too. These two towers were the only buildings, perhaps in the world, but definitely in the US, that did not need to get permit from the city. Why? Because the Port Authority was specially formed, approved by Congress, and they had to have the freedom not to follow the laws of New York or New Jersey. They were independent of both states, so they could build those bridges. That was the idea. but this is the reason why they could use this strange system that finally collapsed because of the failure of engineers to think of what will happen to this new system if it gets into fire.